Hello, my awesome accounting students. Welcome back to day 2 of process costing. Today will be mostly a review of what we've already covered. Recall that we've been going through 4 steps in order to come up with the amount transferred out and the amount of costs still left in ending WIP. Let's recap those 4 steps first. Step 1. Track the units. We'll use a T account to help us visualize what happens to the work in process account. Step 2. Compute the equivalent units of production, which often is a challenging step for students. My hope is that you've spent some time practicing the first half of the homework and that you will have become proficient at doing this second critical step. The third step brings dollars into the mix. We'll compute the cost for 1 unit, or as your agenda says, compute the cost per equivalent units of production. And then finally, in step 4, we'll dollarize the cost, allocating the costs in to either transferred out or to the ending WIP that's hanging around left unfinished at the end of the month. Let's jump in and get started. On this exercise, we'll notice that the author gives us information in units as well as in dollars. Since we know that the first 2 steps focuses on units, let's go ahead and take a look at this box. I suggest, as we did in the last half of the chapter, that you create a T account so that you can visually see what's going on within the WIP account. Again, this is just in units. My red subtotal shows that we started with 2,000 units in our beginning WIP, and we had 6,000 more units started during the period. If we continue reading through the chart that the author gives us, we had 7,000 of those units transferred out either to the next department or into finished goods. In this exercise, I believe there is another department, and that leaves us 1,000 units sitting in ending WIP. Just as we learned last time, the costs in, or actually in this case the units in, have to also equal the units distributed. Using color here, another way of saying that is the yellow units in have to equal the green units being distributed between transferred out and ending WIP. So use that information in the T account to fill in the formal step number 1, track the units. I'm going to give you a chance to do that and pause the video. On the screen, you'll see step 1, track the units completed based on the information we entered in our T account. Step 2, probably one of the toughest steps for students to comprehend, is also based on just units, so no dollars. And in this critical step, we ask the question, what were the equivalent units of production? In other words, we transferred out 7,000 units. However, if our efforts would have been focused from start to finish, how many units could we have completed? As we discussed last time, the weighted average method always views the transferred out units as 100% complete with respect to both materials and conversions. So we'll carry that 7,000 units across. The ending WIP, often the step that gives students the most trouble, has or is representative of the units that are still left incomplete. So as we use weighted average, we need to ask ourselves, how far along did they get? The problem tells us that the materials were 100% complete on the ending WIP, and the conversion costs were 60% complete. So looking at our ending WIP line, the $1,000 units multiplied by 100% would of course give us the same 1,000 units, and the 1,000 units multiplied by 60% would be the equivalent of 600 units getting conversion costs. This is a critical step. It will drive the remainder of the problem. So the equivalent units for materials were 8,000 units. The equivalent units for conversion was 7,600. Take a moment to take a look over that work and make sure you understand the first two steps before we bring dollars into the mix in steps 3 and 4. Time to bring dollars into the mix. I've clipped the WIP account with the dollars in it so we wouldn't have to be going up and down the screen. So it looks like our beginning WIP came to us with $4,000 of costs in it. Somewhere they're going to have to tell us how those were split out. And then this month we had 7,200 of materials added and 17,400 of conversion costs added. Let me scroll up and see if we can see how the beginning WIP was split up. It is given to us up here in the first sentence. It said the 2,000 units in beginning WIP had direct materials of 2,400 and conversion costs of 1,600. So we'll carry that 2,400 and 1,600 down to our beginning WIP number, 2,400 and 1,600. That gives us costs to be accounted for of 28,600. If we were to highlight this WIP account in yellow, we would see the cost coming in totaling up 28,600. In order to get the cost per unit, we'll need to divide by those ending or equivalent units of production that we just computed. So we'll take the 9,600 in cost divided by 8,000 units and the 19,000 in conversion costs divided by 7,600 units. I'm going to let Excel compute that for me. And once we do this, this will give us how much one unit costs to complete. For materials, the cost per unit is $1.20. And for conversion cost, the cost per unit is $2.50, resulting in one whole unit for everything costing $3.70. Take a look at that. And once again, if there's anything you don't understand, please reach out. Step 4, we're ready to dollarize, which means we're going to take these two layers that we came up with in step 2 and multiply them by the per unit cost that we came up with in step number 3. So let me write the calculations down. All 7,000 units would have received materials at the cost of $120 per unit, and all 7,000 units would have received conversion costs at the rate of $2.50 per unit. However, on the ending WIP, 1,000 of the units or the full units got material costs, but remember from step 2, only 600 of those equivalent units received the conversion costs. Take a moment, do the math, add across and down, and let's check our work together. Here's the completed step 4. We take a look at the transferred out layer. 25,900 would have been allocated out to that, and 2,700 would have been allocated out to the ending WIP. Take a moment to check your work. I suggest using this WIP account that now has dollars in it and making sure that the total costs in this case in yellow, equals the total cost distributed, or the amounts in green. By now, we should be getting ourselves in a rhythm so that we do the same 4 steps the same way each and every time. If you can do that, you will master process costing. Let's move on to the next one. The critical equivalent units of production step is where we compute how many units we could have completed with the same level of effort. As we know, all 100% of the transferred out layer is carried over. Ending WIP is always in some sort of incomplete status. So up at the top, the author tells us that all the units got conversion, but only 100% of the units got materials, but only 60% of the units got conversion costs. So we take that 2,500 units from step 1 and multiply it by 100% and 60% respectively. When we add those layers up, we have the total equivalent units of 34,500 and 33,500. Step 3 is the first time we're going to bring dollars into the mix. I snipped the dollar chart from above so I wouldn't have to change the page or screen on you. We laid out our beginning WIP, those units that came to us from last month in an incomplete state. We then added in this month's layer of cost. We footed them. Notice how the 567,000 that we're using agrees to the chart. We want to make sure that we don't make any transposition errors. And then we divided by step 2. We divided by the number of equivalent units, resulting in a cost per unit of $10.90 for materials and $5.70 for conversion. If the author asked you how much was one whole or complete unit, you would add those two up and your answer would be $16.60. Let's move on to the last step, allocate the costs or dollarize. So take a look at the last step and let's see how you did. The goal is to take the amounts on step 2, the number of equivalent units, and multiply by the cost per unit that you attained in step 3. So once again, we're working on dollarizing the units. That's a made-up word. So 32,000 units on the transferred out layer multiplied by $10.90 gave us the transferred out materials, and the 32,000 units times the $5.70 gave us our conversion cost. We cross-footed or added across. The ending WIP had 2,500 units of materials and 1,500 units of converted units, conversion, labor, and overhead, multiplied by the same rate, $10.90 for materials and $5.70 for conversion costs. We did the math, we added it down, we added it across, and then to finally check our work, once again, I used a visual cue for the WIP account in dollars, where I inserted the cost coming in and double checked it against how the costs were distributed. We have to make sure that the cost coming in equals the sum of the costs distributed. If you have that down and the light is starting to flicker, you can almost be assured that process costing mastery is on the way. Here's what a formal production cost report would look like. This carries the information that we just finished with in our 4 steps over to a formal report. I won't ask you to do one of these on the exam, but it's always a good idea to familiarize yourself with what the solution in Connect will look like. So pause the video and match it up against the work that you should have been creating with me. Our next problem is going to show how there can be multiple departmental WIP accounts. The basic purpose of this exercise is to make sure that you understand how costs can move between the various WIP departments. So pause the video for a moment, drop in these beginning and ending inventory for these 4 different asset accounts. And then we'll come back together and work through the transactions. The first transaction says we purchased materials on account for $500,000. So go ahead and debit the raw materials account, and credit, since it says we bought it on account, we would use accounts payable. Again, we're really only concerned about the job costing accounts, but because we don't want one-sided items, I went ahead and put that generic account in there. Other actual overhead. As soon as you see the word actual, we're going to the debit side. We'll just call that other factory overhead, and that was in the amount of $156,000. Since it says we paid cash, we'll go down to that other balance sheet account and put that $156,000 in there, and that was overhead for cash. Okay, we're following the cost from birth to death. Here comes the materials used. Materials are going into two different departments now, weaving and sewing. So they would both come out of the materials account. So direct materials used are actually going to be twofold here. $240,000 will be taken out of raw materials and will go into WIP for the weaving. We have a second set of raw materials used, so I'll go ahead and put that second one. Raw materials used, but this time it's coming out of the materials and going directly into the second department, or the sewing department. It was mentioned that all of the costs that come into the first WIP account, weaving, are transferred into sewing. So that means we need to figure out how much of that cost was finished. So let's go ahead and subtotal our WIP account by adding the top to the bottom. Since there were $330,000 of a WIP inventory still left in weaving, we know that the difference must have been transferred out. So you can use either that yellow or green box. I went ahead and calculated that to be $2,370,000. That money would come out of the first department and move in to the next department. Let me go grab that amount. Okay, so now we have WIP for the second and last department. We started with $570,000. We had all of those items from the previous department coming in. We call that just costs in. And then we had the sewing department's material, labor, and overhead. So once again, we're going to subtotal this from top to bottom, picking up all the costs. We have $3,915,000. Of that amount, there was $700,000 still sitting around unfinished in the sewing department. So the difference between these two would come out of sewing and go into finished goods. You can call that the cost of goods manufactured for that department. $3,215,000. That comes out of sewing and goes in to finished goods. So let me go ahead and put that same amount in, $3,215,000, to get the final amount transferred to cost of goods sold. We'll sum up. Whoops, a daisy. Let's put a subtotal there. Make it red so it stands out. We'll subtotal the finished goods account. Take a look at how much ending inventory was waiting around at the end of the month. That means the difference between those two must have been sold. So that cost of goods sold is $3,275,000. It comes out of WIP and goes, or excuse me, it comes out of finished goods and goes into cost of goods sold. Again, once it hits cost of goods sold, this is where the cost dies. Take a look. at the information on the screen, compare it to yours, and then we'll come back and talk about the journal entries that the author requests. We use T accounts to show you the costs being born and then dying and cost of goods sold. The formal solution would look like you see on the screen. I would pause the video, maybe take a screenshot, put that in your notes, and make sure that you understand where the numbers came from. This is an exact replica of what we did in the T accounts, just in a more formal format. Then finally, the author asked you for a few journal entries. So let's take a moment to look at those. Once again, all of this is included in the T accounts we just completed. Here is the transfer of cost from weaving to sewing. We showed you how to calculate that. Here is the cost of the completed goods transferred from sewing to finished goods. Here are those sales on account of $4 million. And here's the cost of goods sold that we calculated on the T accounts. Exercise 1625 asks us to record the journal entries for the raw materials purchases, the direct and indirect materials used, the direct and indirect labor used, the other overhead costs, and the overhead applied. Again, we showed all of this in the T account, but here is a summary of all the journal entries that the author requested. Once again, the T account is the picture worth 1,000 words, but the only way that we can get our transactions into the accounting system is through the journal entry process. You may want to pause the video, look them over, and if you have any questions, reach out. Our final problem is a great summary of what the process costing chapter was about. It gave us some information in units as well as in dollars, and it asks us what most process costing problems ask us is to walk through the 4 steps. So what I would like you to do is to use this as a review to assess yourself and see if you're ready for a test question. On this problem, I would expect you to be able to compute the equivalent units, and in order to compute the equivalent units, I would add an additional step of track the units. Once you have step 2 down, equivalent units, go ahead and finish out the remaining steps by calculating the cost per equivalent unit, and finally dollarizing or assigning cost to the department's output. I would use this to wrap it up to see if you're ready for a test question. And so I will put the 4 steps up there after you pause the video and try and complete it on your own. Here's the answer. Step 1, track the units. As you saw in the T account, the beginning WIP plus the units started gave us 88,000 units to account for. Those units went either one of 2 places, either transferred out or to ending WIP. The equality has to be there at every juncture. Step 2, equivalent units. How many units could we have completed if our efforts were focused? As always, weighted average assumes 100% completion of the transferred out units. That means all 80,000 units got materials and all 80,000 units got conversion costs. The ending WIP is usually the problem one. The author told us that of the 8,000 units in ending WIP, all of them received materials, but the conversion was only at a rate of 25%. So 8,000 times 100% is 8,000, and 8,000 times 25% is 2,000. Add those 2 up and check out your equivalent units. This step will drive the rest of the solution. So if you miss step 2, the errors will continue down to the last 2 steps. Step 3 was to compute the cost per equivalent unit. In this step, we took a look at the cost coming in to give us our numerator, and the denominator came from step 2. So based on the author's information, we started off with beginning WIP totaling $144,400. We had this month cost totaling $2.692 million. We added them up. We divided by the equivalent units. Notice that they match the equivalent units from step 2. And when we do the division, we came up with $8.75 for one equivalent unit for materials and $25.20 for one equivalent unit for conversion costs. When we add those two together, one fully completed unit is costed at $33.95. Finally, step 4, which in my lingo is to dollarize. Your author will probably say something like allocate the cost to the appropriate layers. The transferred out layer, one of the most important layers we're computing, should be costed out at $2,716,000, and the ending WIP should be costed at $124,400. I would encourage you to use that final T account to show that the cost coming in equals the cost distributed. In fact, let me scroll over to my final T account here, and I show that the cost coming in, totaling that red number, equates to the cost going out, distributed to the transferred out and to the ending WIP. If you were successfully able to complete that problem, then other than walking yourselves through the theory and the definitions, it looks like you're ready to go. This is not an easy chapter. The more you practice, the better off you'll be. Professor Johnson, signing out.